Moment 1. In 1814, the British military decided that the best way to intimidate American forces during the War of 1812 was to burn down the White House. They succeeded. Then they just left. The Americans didn't surrender. Instead, they rebuilt it. The entire operation accomplished nothing except giving Americans a really solid revenge story. Moment 2. King Charles II of Spain inherited a throne through a family tree so inbred that he had a 16% chance of being his own grandfather. His jaw was so deformed he couldn't chew properly. He was infertile. But nobody thought to maybe marry someone from outside the family. Instead, they kept doubling down on the same bloodline. It's like the royal family was speed-running genetic collapse. Moment 3. In 1633, the Dutch traded Manhattan Island to the British for a small spice island called Run. Let me be clear, they thought they were winning. Manhattan is now worth roughly $2 trillion. The Spice Island is basically forgotten. This might be the worst real estate deal in human history. Moment 4. Medieval doctors believed that bleeding patients would cure almost everything. Infections? Bleed them. Broken bones? Bleed them. Actually dying? Better bleed them faster. They killed countless people based on a theory so backward that it would take 3 more centuries to realize you shouldn't drain sick people of blood. Moment 5. Napoleon spent the entire 1812 winter invading Russia with a grand strategy that basically amounted to let's just keep marching north. When his army started dying from cold and disease, his solution was to keep marching north. By the time he retreated, he'd lost over 400,000 men. He lost the war. He lost France. He lost everything. All because he couldn't read a calendar. Moment 6. In 1912, the Titanic was supposedly unsinkable because it was so massive. The ship was built with a fatal design flaw. The watertight compartments didn't go high enough. The designers knew about this. They just didn't care. When the ship hit an iceberg, it sank in 3 hours. They had enough lifeboats for maybe 37% of the people on board. Over 500 people drowned. And someone really did try to go down with the ship because that's what gentlemen did, apparently. Moment 7. The Challenger space shuttle launch was cleared for takeoff on January 28, 1986. Despite engineers repeatedly warning that the O-rings would fail in cold temperatures. The launch was in Florida. It was cold. The O-rings failed. All 7 crew members died. The engineers were right. Nobody listened. This is what happens when administrators overrule actual scientists. Moment 8. King Henry VIII became so obsessed with having a male heir that he divorced his wife, executed his second wife, and split the entire Church of England because a pope wouldn't let him marry someone else. His son took the throne briefly. Then he died. Then a woman took the throne anyway. All that religious chaos, all those deaths, for absolutely nothing. Moment 9. The Library of Alexandria, possibly the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled, burned down. Multiple times. Different sources blame everyone. Accidental fires, deliberate destruction, invasions. Thousands of ancient texts vanished. Humanity lost centuries of scientific and philosophical work. And we're still not even sure exactly what happened. Moment 10. Stalin starved millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s through forced collectivization policies that made absolutely no agricultural sense. He had grain surpluses but refused to release them for food. He exported grain while people died of hunger. It was genocide dressed up as economic policy. Somewhere around 7 million people died because someone decided ideology mattered more than food supply. Moment 11. Japan's military in World War II believed that suicide attacks were an honorable tactic. This belief persisted even as it became mathematically obvious that it wasn't working. Pilots crashed into ships knowing they would die, which somehow made other soldiers want to fight harder despite all evidence suggesting they should probably surrender. Ideology over logic. Every single time. Moment 12. The Vietnam War lasted 20 years and cost 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives. And it ended exactly where it started, with Vietnam being unified under communist control. The entire war was predestined to fail. Everyone knew it after about year 5. It continued anyway. Moment 13. Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. Native Americans already lived there. He was searching for a route to Asia, failed to find it, and then enslaved the people he encountered while claiming he'd done something significant. Every textbook celebrates him as a visionary explorer. He was just lost and terrible at his job. Moment 14. The Hindenburg was filled with hydrogen, which is extremely flammable. Everyone knew hydrogen was extremely flammable. They used it anyway because they thought it was a good idea. In 1937, it caught fire while landing. 36 people died. One person filming the disaster shouted, "Oh, the humanity," which has become the most dramatic way possible to document human stupidity. Moment 15. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic killed between 50 to 100 million people worldwide. Countries knew it was spreading. They held public gatherings anyway. They refused to quarantine people. They spread it faster and killed more people through pure inaction and stubbornness. Nations chose to not learn from each other's mistakes despite watching each other die. Moment 16. Medieval people believed that a good way to cure leprosy was to bathe in the blood of small children. This was not based on any medical theory. It was pure superstition that resulted in children being killed. This wasn't rare. It was practiced across multiple countries. People saw it not working and did it anyway. Moment 17. The 1666 Great Fire of London destroyed most of the city because nobody had bothered to enforce basic fire safety regulations, even though London had burned down multiple times before. After the fire, they rebuilt the exact same wooden structures in the exact same density in the exact same way. It took them decades to actually use brick and stone. Moment 18. British colonizers believed that ruling India would be profitable. They extracted so much wealth that India's share of global GDP collapsed from 23% to under 4%. They created artificial famines through forced crop exports. Millions starved. By the time they left, they destroyed the economy so thoroughly that recovery took generations. And they're still considered a successful empire by some people. Moment 19. The Dunning-Kruger effect was named after two men who didn't understand their own incompetence. But that's not the dumb part. The dumb part is that we now use this term to describe a universal human tendency, and people still can't recognize it in themselves. We've named stupidity. We've studied stupidity. And stupidity continues to flourish. Moment 20. Medical schools used to teach that different races had different-sized brains, which determined intelligence. This was presented as science. It was pseudoscience designed to justify racism. Millions of policy decisions were based on literally false information, and these weren't fringe beliefs. They were mainstream medical doctrine. Moment 21. Rome spent centuries building an empire so massive it became physically impossible to govern. Generals started fighting each other for control. The infrastructure crumbled. The military spread too thin, and nobody said, maybe this was a bad idea. They just let it collapse under its own weight while blaming each other. Moment 22. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened because Soviet engineers decided to run a safety test that violated every safety protocol, using untrained staff without properly informing the reactor operators. The reactor exploded. A massive radiation cloud spread across Europe. They covered it up. Only later did the world find out just how catastrophic the negligence had been. Moment 23. The Tuskegee syphilis study involved the U.S. government deliberately withholding penicillin from black men with syphilis so they could observe the disease's progression. This wasn't the 1800s. This was 1932 to 1972. 40 years. 4 decades of intentional medical abuse. By the time it was exposed, the damage was permanent. Moment 24. Bloodletting remained standard medical practice until the 1900s, which means doctors in the 20th century were still draining sick people of blood. A patient would come in sick, and the doctor's response was literally to make them weaker. Somehow, this didn't cure them. Moment 25. The Irish famine occurred not because there was no food in Ireland, but because the English policy of requiring Irish farmers to export grain continued even as people starved. Ships left Irish ports full of food while Irish children died of hunger. Policy and ideology mattered more than human survival. Moment 26. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon after the Watergate scandal, essentially saying, "It's fine. You can break the law and become president, and we won't do anything about it." This decision probably shaped American politics for the next 50 years, and he did it without really thinking about the long-term consequences. Moment 27. The Rwandan genocide killed 800,000 people in 100 days. The international community watched. The UN had peacekeeping forces on the ground. They didn't intervene. They couldn't agree on whether it was actually a genocide. People died while governments debated the definition. Moment 28. The Soviet Union spent billions on the space race, achieving stunning technological feats, while their citizens waited in lines for basic food. The government prioritized appearing powerful over actually helping people. When the system finally collapsed, nobody was surprised. Moment 29. Lobotomies were considered a revolutionary psychiatric treatment. Thousands of people had their brains surgically damaged. It didn't help anyone. It just left them permanently disabled. And the doctors who performed them were celebrated for being innovative. One of them won a Nobel Prize. Moment 30. The Challenger disaster could have been prevented with one phone call from an engineer who understood O-ring physics, but the call was never made because of hierarchical communication failures. 7 people died because of corporate bureaucracy. And this wasn't even an anomaly. It's how most disasters happen. Moment 31. Britain decided to build a railway across India because it would be good for the empire. The decision ignored the fact that India already had extensive road networks. The railways benefited British extraction of resources and the British soldiers' ability to crush Indian rebellions. When India gained independence, the infrastructure served extraction, not the Indian people. Pure colonial arrogance dressed up as progress. Moment 32. The Third Reich was based on the premise that science could determine which humans were superior and which were inferior. This wasn't fringe ideology. It was mainstream pseudoscience accepted by respected scientists. They killed millions based on this obviously false premise, and after the war, some of the same scientists just moved on, unchanged. Moment 33. The US decision to use nuclear weapons on Japan was presented as necessary to end the war quickly. But Japan was already defeated. Their military knew it. The leadership knew it. The only reason for the bomb was to test it on human population and to intimidate the Soviet Union. Over 200,000 people died in 2 explosions for geopolitical messaging. Moment 34. The 2008 financial crisis happened because banks created complex financial instruments that literally nobody understood. They knew nobody understood them. They sold them anyway. When it collapsed, they had to be bailed out by the government. The same government that supposedly regulates them. The people responsible faced almost no consequences, and within a few years, they were doing it again. History is just repeating patterns of confident, intelligent-sounding people making catastrophically stupid decisions. We've got proof that bleeding patients doesn't cure them, and we still ignore evidence when it contradicts what we want to believe. We've watched empires collapse from overextension, and we still overextend. We've seen genocides happen in real time while the world watches, and we still fail to act. The names change. The technology changes. The fundamental human tendency to make easily preventable mistakes remains constant. So here's the real question. If we can document 34 different ways history went wrong, ways that were obvious even at the time, what catastrophically stupid thing are we doing right now that we'll spend the next century debunking?